The Chicago winter landscape was a scene pulled straight from a luxury travel magazine. In the exclusive suburbs of Naperville, snow fell with a silent grace, coating the roofs of multi-million-dollar mansions in a pristine, shimmering blanket of white. But no house burned brighter than the Miller residence. From a block away, you could see the radiant glow of 50,000 micro-LED lights wrapping around the stone pillars of their estate. A life-sized mechanical reindeer pulled a velvet sleigh across the front lawn, nodding its head to every neighbor who drove by, a loud, undeniable symbol of the American dream. To the outside world, the Millers were the golden family. Inside, the opulence was even more overwhelming. A 14-foot Douglas fir stood in the grand foyer, dripping with hand-blown crystal ornaments and gold silk ribbons. Beneath it lay a mountain of designer-wrapped gifts, the latest tech for their son, Leo, high-end jewelry for Sarah, and a vintage timepiece for David. The scent of cinnamon, pine, and expensive candles filled the air, accompanied by the soft, synthesized hum of "It's the most wonderful time of the year," playing through the integrated home theater system. But behind the glitter there was a suffocating silence. David Miller stood by the floor-to-ceiling window on the second floor, staring at his reflection in the glass. At 45, he was a highly successful structural engineer. He had designed bridges that spanned great divides and skyscrapers that defied gravity, yet he felt the very foundations of his soul were cracking. He held a glass of eggnog that had gone cold, his eyes fixed vacantly on the streetlights outside. "David? Are you coming down? The guests will be here in 2 hours." Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. Sarah entered the room, looking radiant in an elegant red velvet dress. She had spent weeks meticulously planning this Christmas Eve gala. She had secured the best caterers, ensured every sprig of mistletoe was perfectly placed, and invited the most influential people in their social circle. But as David turned to look at her, he didn't see joy. He saw exhaustion, not a physical tiredness, but a spiritual one. "I was just thinking, Sarah," David said quietly. Is this all there is? Every year we buy more lights, wrap more boxes, and yet I feel further away from the truth than ever. We celebrate the birth of a prophet who lived in the ultimate simplicity by being as extravagant as humanly possible. It doesn't make sense anymore." Sarah remained silent. She stepped closer and placed her hand on David's arm. She wanted to argue, to tell him they were just making memories, but her own heart felt hollow. For the past year, Sarah had been waking up in the middle of the night with an inexplicable sense of dread. She went to church, she did the charity auctions, but she felt like she was just performing a script. God felt like a distant concept, buried under layers of tradition and dogma that no longer answered her deepest questions about life and death. "I feel it too," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the festive music downstairs. "Yesterday, at the crowded mall, I saw people shoving each other for the last discounted toy. I wondered, is this what he wanted from us? Where is the peace, David? Where is the sacred stillness?" In the next room, their 16-year-old son, Leo, sat at his desk. He had every gaming console he could ever want, but he spent his nights on history and philosophy forums. He felt alienated from his peers who only cared about brand names and status. Leo often wondered why the world was so noisy yet had so little to say. The Miller family was the ultimate irony of modern life. They possessed everything money could buy, but nothing the soul required. The commercialism of the season had become a mask too heavy to wear. Tonight's party, with its forced laughter and talk of stocks and Caribbean vacations, felt like a play they no longer wanted to act in. That night, as the Chicago wind howled outside and the temperature plunged, David prayed in a way he never had before. It wasn't a memorized prayer from a book. It was a silent, desperate cry from the depths of his being. "God, if you are truly there, if there is a path to peace that doesn't involve more things, please show it to me. Give me a sign before this year ends." He didn't know that only a few hundred yards away, in a modest house with no lights and no tree, the answer to his prayer was waiting. A miracle was coming, not through a chimney, but through a simple conversation in the heart of a blizzard. The blizzard of December 23rd was unlike anything Naperville had seen in a decade. The wind screamed across the suburban plains, turning the festive decorations into blurred ghosts of red and green. By 8 p.m., the power grid flickered and died, plunging the Miller mansion into a cold, eerie darkness. The 50,000 lights that had shouted their wealth to the world were suddenly silenced. David struggled to start the backup generator, but the frozen lines refused to budge. With the house temperature dropping rapidly, he decided to take the SUV to fetch some emergency supplies from the 24-hour depot. "Stay here, wrap yourselves in blankets," he told Sarah and Leo. "I'll be back in 20 minutes. But the road was a white void. Less than half a mile from his driveway, the SUV hit a patch of black ice, spinning violently before sliding into a deep snowdrift. The engine groaned and stalled. David was stuck. He stepped out into the biting wind, his designer coat feeling like paper against the sub-zero chill. He looked around, disoriented, until he saw a faint, warm amber glow coming from a small, modest brick house tucked away behind a row of pine trees. It was the only house on the block that seemed to have light. Shivering and gasping for air, David stumbled toward the porch and knocked. The door opened to reveal a man in his late 60s. He had a neatly trimmed white beard and eyes that seemed to hold a profound, quiet strength. He wore a simple wool sweater and a small, knitted cap. My car. I'm your neighbor from down the street," David managed to say through chattering teeth. "Come in, friend, come in quickly," the man said, his voice calm and steady. "I am Ibrahim. You are freezing." As David stepped inside, the contrast was staggering. There was no towering tree, no tinsel, and no mountain of gifts. The house was heated by a small wood-burning stove that filled the room with a dry, comforting warmth. The air smelled of mint and a faint, earthy spice David couldn't identify. "I have a small solar battery for my lamps," Ibrahim explained, handing David a steaming cup of tea. "The storm is fierce, but the tea is warm. Drink." David sat on a simple wooden chair, his hands shaking as he held the cup. He looked around the room. It was nearly empty of the status symbols David had spent his life accumulating, yet it felt full. The walls weren't decorated with expensive art, but with elegant, flowing calligraphy in a language David didn't recognize. "You have no decorations," David remarked, his curiosity getting the better of his manners. "Do you not celebrate?" Ibrahim smiled, a genuine expression that reached his eyes. "I am a Muslim, David. My celebration is of a different kind. I find my festivities in the quiet of the night, in the remembrance of the Creator." David looked at the tea in his hand. "Remembrance? Most of us use this time of year to forget. We forget our stress, we forget our debt, we forget ourselves in the buying and the eating. Perhaps that is why you feel so cold, even when your house is full of lights," Ibrahim said softly. He wasn't judging, he was simply stating a truth. David felt a lump in his throat. This man, who lived in a house a fraction of the size of his own, possessed a tranquility that David would have given his entire bank account to achieve. On the small table next to Ibrahim sat a book with a dark green cover, worn at the edges from frequent use. "Is that your Bible?" David asked. "This is the Quran," Ibrahim replied, picking it up with a gentle reverence. "It is the final testament. It is the map I use when the storms of life become too loud to hear my own heart." For the first time in years, David didn't feel the need to talk about his job, his car, or his social standing. In the dim amber light of Ibrahim's living room, as the blizzard raged outside, David felt like a traveler who had finally found a shelter that wasn't made of gold, but of something much more durable. "Tell me," David whispered, leaning closer to the stove. "What does that book say about peace? Because I've looked everywhere else, and I can't find it." Ibrahim opened the book, the pages whispering in the quiet room. "It says, David, that verily, in the remembrance of Allah do hearts find rest. It says that we were not created to be slaves to things, but to be the servants of the one who created the things." That night, as the snow piled high against the door, the first seeds of a miracle were planted in the frozen soil of David Miller's soul. The storm outside seemed to create a vacuum, sealing the two men in a bubble of warmth and profound stillness. While the rest of the neighborhood sat in dark houses, shivering and frustrated by the loss of their digital lives, David Miller felt a strange, magnetic pull toward the words of his neighbor. "I've always respected Jesus," David began, his voice barely a whisper. "I grew up with him. But lately he feels like a figure trapped in a stained glass window, beautiful, but unreachable. And the way we celebrate him now, it feels like we've turned him into a spokesperson for a shopping mall." Ibrahim nodded slowly. He didn't look at David with pity, but with the understanding of a man who had once stood in the same darkness. "In Islam, David, Jesus, Isa, as we call him, is not a distant figure. He is a brother, a beloved messenger, a spirit from God. But he is not God. When you remove the layers of mystery that men have added over centuries, you find a man who bowed his head to the same creator we bow to today." David leaned in, the heat from the wood-burning stove reflecting in his eyes. "You mean you follow him too?" "We follow his true message," Ibrahim replied, opening the Quran to a marked page. "The Quran tells us that Mary, was the purest woman of all creation. It describes the miracle of his birth with such detail and honor that it brings tears to the eyes. But it also tells us what Jesus said when he was in the cradle. He said, 'I am indeed a servant of Allah.'" The word servant struck David like a lightning bolt. In his world, everyone wanted to be a master of industry, a master of their social circle, a master of wealth. But as he looked at Ibrahim, he realized that true freedom came from being a servant to the only one who deserved worship. "My whole life," David said, his voice trembling, "I've been taught that faith is complicated. That there are three in one, and mysteries I'm not supposed to understand. But what you're saying, it's so simple. It's almost too simple." "Truth is rarely complicated, David," Ibrahim said, his thumb tracing the calligraphy on the page. "Complexity is often a cage we build for ourselves. Islam is the religion of fitra, the natural inclination of the soul. Your soul knows there is only one God. It's why you feel empty amidst all your things. You are trying to fill a God-sized hole with a mountain of plastic and LED lights." They talked for hours. Ibrahim spoke of the prophets, Abraham, Moses, Noah, and finally Muhammad, peace be upon them all. He explained that they were all links in a single chain, bringing the same message, La ilaha illallah, there is no God but the one God. As the night wore on, David realized that he wasn't learning something new. He was remembering something he had forgotten. The logic of Islam appealed to his engineer's mind, the perfect structure of a universe with one architect. But the mercy of Islam appealed to his dying spirit. If I were to believe this," David stammered, "what happens to my life? What happens to the Christmas tree, the gifts, the traditions?" Ibrahim smiled gently. "You don't lose your love for the prophets. You gain the right way to honor them. You stop worshipping the creation and start worshipping the Creator. You don't lose your family. You become the man they truly need, a man led by light, not by glitter." Just as David was about to speak, the radio in Ibrahim's kitchen crackled. The storm was passing, and the roads were being cleared. It was time for David to go back to his mansion. As David stood up, he felt heavier yet lighter. He looked at the modest room one last time. "I came here because my car hit a snowdrift," David said, shaking Ibrahim's hand. "But I think my whole life has been stuck in a drift, and I'm just now seeing the road." Ibrahim handed David a small, English translation of the Quran. "This is the only gift you'll need this year, David. Read it with your family. The miracle isn't in the storm, it's in what happens after it clears." David walked back into the cold night. The wind had died down, and the stars were beginning to peek through the clouds. He looked at the book in his hand, clutching it tighter than any luxury watch he had ever owned. He wasn't just going home, he was going back to change everything. David walked into his mansion, and the contrast hit him like a physical blow. The power had been restored. The 50,000 lights were screaming once again, casting a cold, artificial rainbow across the snow. Inside, the house was warm, but it felt sterile. Sarah and Leo were sitting in the living room by the massive tree, their faces illuminated by the blue light of their smartphones. "You were gone for hours," Sarah said, jumping up. "We were worried. Did you get the supplies?" David didn't answer immediately. He walked to the center of the room and placed the small, green book on the marble coffee table. It looked tiny and humble next to the towering tree and the piles of expensive gifts. "I didn't get the supplies," David said, his voice carrying a weight that made Leo look up from his phone. "But I found something else. I found a neighbor, and I found a truth I think we've been hiding from." For the next 3 hours, the Millers did something they hadn't done in years. They talked. Truly talked. David told them about Ibrahim, the wood-burning stove, and the concept of Tawhid, the absolute oneness of God. He told them about the Quran's description of Jesus and Mary. Sarah listened, her eyes moving from David to the green book. "A prophet, not a god," she whispered. "David, that's exactly what I felt in my heart during every sermon. I felt like I was being asked to believe in a mystery that didn't want to be solved. But this is clear." Leo picked up the book and began to flip through the pages. He stopped at Surah Maryam. As he read the verses about Mary's strength and the miraculous birth of Jesus, his cynical teenage shell began to crack. "Dad," Leo said, his voice cracking, "I've been reading philosophy for months trying to find a logical reason for our existence. Everything I read was so complicated. But this, it feels like common sense. It feels like the air we're supposed to breathe." The Christmas Eve they had planned, the expensive wine, the talk of renovations, the social climbing, was forgotten. Instead, they sat on the floor, passing the Quran between them. "We have spent millions of dollars trying to buy happiness," Sarah said, looking at the mountain of gifts under the tree. "And yet, a man with a wood stove and a cup of tea is more at peace than we are. We are worshipping the gift, David, and we've forgotten the giver." As the clock struck midnight, the bells of the distant cathedral began to ring, signaling the start of Christmas morning. Usually, this was the cue for the Millers to go to sleep so they could wake up and consume. But tonight, they felt no urge to sleep. "I don't want to just know this," David said, looking at his wife and son. "I want to be this. I realize tonight that I don't want to celebrate a holiday that has become a monument to greed. I want to celebrate the one who created me, every single day of my life." Sarah took his hand. "Then let's go see him. Let's see Ibrahim. I want to know how to bow. I want to know how to pray without the noise." The epiphany was complete. The Miller family, surrounded by the peak of American material success, realized that their real life hadn't even begun yet. They didn't need the holiday spirit. They needed the Holy Spirit's guidance as defined by the final message. The lights on the tree suddenly looked like dim candles compared to the sun that was rising in their hearts. The sun rose on December 25th over a Chicago blanketed in a crisp, diamond-like frost. It was the quietest morning of the year. While millions of families were tearing through wrapping paper in a frenzy of consumerism, the Millers were preparing for a different kind of birth, the birth of their new selves. David, Sarah, and Leo didn't head to the dining room for a lavish brunch. Instead, they drove back to the modest brick house. Ibrahim was on his porch, clearing the last of the snow. He didn't seem surprised to see them. In fact, he looked as though he had been waiting. "We are ready," David said, his voice steady, his eyes clear for the first time in decades. Ibrahim drove them to a small community mosque in the city. It wasn't a grand cathedral with gold leaf or towering spires. It was a simple, clean building with a dome that caught the morning sun. Inside, the air was cool and still, carrying the faint scent of musk. There were no statues, no pews, and no distractions, just a vast, open space that felt as wide as the horizon. A small group of men and women from various backgrounds, African, Arab, Asian, and European, were finishing their morning prayers. Ibrahim led the Millers to the Imam, a man with a gentle face who welcomed them not as strangers, but as family returning from a long journey. "You are seeking the truth?" the Imam asked softly. "We found it," Sarah replied, her hand trembling slightly as she held David's. We realize that the greatest gift isn't something you can hold in your hand. It's the peace of knowing who we belong to. The Imam explained the meaning of the Shahada, the testimony of faith. He told them that by saying these words, their past mistakes would be wiped clean, and they would stand before God as pure as the snow outside. One by one they stood. David went first. Ashhadu alla ilaha illallah. As the words left his lips, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders, the weight of the corporate ladders, the social expectations, and the hollow pride. Sarah followed, her voice a beautiful, emotional whisper. Wa ashhadu anna Muhammada Rasulullah. She felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sacred stillness, that no church choir or expensive gala had ever provided. Finally Leo spoke. His voice was firm, the voice of a young man who had finally found a philosophy worth living for. When they finished, the small congregation approached them. There were no expensive gifts exchanged, only sincere embraces and whispers of brother and sister. Ibrahim stood in the back, a single tear tracing a path through his white beard. He knew that the blizzard had been a mercy, a storm sent to break the ice of their hearts. As the Millers walked out of the mosque, the world looked different. The Christmas lights in the city still twinkled, but they no longer felt blinding. The cars were still expensive, but they no longer felt important. What do we do now, Dad? Leo asked as they stood in the fresh air. David looked at his family. They were no longer just the Millers of Naperville, they were a family of believers. No, David said, smiling. We go home and live for the one who gave us everything. We start our lives for real. The Miller family drove home, leaving the hollow celebration behind. They had walked into the mosque as three people who had everything, and they walked out as three people who finally knew that they needed nothing but God. It was the greatest miracle Chicago had ever seen, a miracle of light, found in the heart of a silent, winter night.